And now it's the moment you've all been waiting for. Joining me to discuss the Labour Party's surrender to the bureaucracy is the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Liz, first of all, thank you very much for joining me. You got the blame, and Labour ran this hard through the election campaign for crashing the economy because of the mini-budget. I was one of your ministers at the time, so I take a share of responsibility for that too. And there's this really interesting report from the Bank of England, and it now seems it was the Bank of England who crashed the economy. Can you explain what they have admitted to, what it has admitted to?
So the Bank of England put out a report in May with no fanfare whatsoever. It's available on their website. And what they demonstrate is that 2/3 of all of the market movement on gilts was down to LDIs. So this is the special type of investment that pension funds had been encouraged to do and were very, very susceptible to small changes in the interest rate. So the spike we saw after the mini-budget was, in fact, down to these products that the Bank of England, who are responsible for financial stability, had failed to ensure were being properly managed. I mean, that's what happened. So they admit 2/3 of all of that market movement was essentially down to them.
And they lost a lot of money in their own pension fund on these instruments because of the movements in government debt.
That is true. And of course, lots of other major pension funds were invested. In fact, the UK had 60% of the world's LDIs held, partly because of the way that pension funds were regulated and supervised, which was the responsibility of the pensions regulator and Bank of England. It's worth saying I knew nothing about this. So when we put together the mini-budget, which was fully signed off internally in government, we had no expectation at all that there would be this problem triggered. So we didn't know about it. And I'm all for politicians taking responsibility, but it's difficult to take responsibility for something you don't know about, that people who do know about it, you can't sack them, you can't change them, they are there. That puts a politician in a very difficult position.
But did we, in fact, make a bigger mistake? And that is that we didn't focus on trying to change the institutions, that we knew there were issues with the Bank of England and we knew that there were issues with the ABR, and we weren't willing to say the ABR must be closed down. It was just cut out of the discussion.
Well, look, I would have loved to close the ABR down, and I would have loved to make the Bank of England more accountable to ministers. But the reality is we had 2 years until an election. I thought the most important priority was getting the British economy growing. I thought we would have no chance of winning the election until we started putting money in people's pockets. And you know how long legislation takes. You were leader of the House. You know, we would have not got the legislation through. In fact, we'd still be debating the ABR and the Bank of England 2 years later, and the British public would be saying, what on earth have you been doing, Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg? You've been in the House of Commons, changing institutional structures. Meanwhile, you're not getting on with the very important tax changes, regulatory changes that we need to make Britain work. Now, in a future Conservative government, of course, we need to sort out these institutional structures, and we need to be very clear about that. But what's happening today is Labour actually making the situation worse. We struggled because too much power had been handed over to unelected bureaucrats. They want to double down on that. I mean, it's amazing. The Chancellor seems to want to make no decisions about the economy. Gordon Brown handed over the power to the Bank of England over interest rates, and now Rachel Reeves wants to hand over all the power on fiscal policy to the Office of Budget Responsibility. You might ask, what is she actually there for?
And the ABR's record is terrible. I mean, year in, year out, it gets its forecast wrong, and yet it's held up as this body of wise people that comes up with unchallengeable forecasts. How have we got into this state? Is it that politicians have lost confidence in their own judgment? Because the ABR was obviously set up by a Conservative government. It's not the only example of a quanging. National England, the Climate Change Committee, these bodies that increasingly make policy, and the politicians just seem to sit back and let them do it. Have we lost confidence in our own profession?
I certainly think it's true that politicians have outsourced a lot of decision-making. I mean, the OBR is particularly dysfunctional because the Treasury now doesn't have the expertise to do forecasting, so it can't do one half of the job. The OBR doesn't know all the inside details of what's actually going on in government, so it can only do half the job. You have a crazy situation, and I saw this as Chief Secretary, where the OBR sends new figures every 2 weeks, and suddenly £20 billion will appear, and suddenly £20 billion will disappear according to the particular forecast that week, and that is no way to run a country. So what has happened is, if you look at Nigel Lawson or Geoffrey Howe, the great chancellors of the 1980s, they had full responsibility for monetary and fiscal policy. They decided, we're monetarists, we're going to focus on the money supply. What happened is when the Bank of England was independent, they independently decided not to focus on the money supply. So there was no measure of the money supply in their inflation model. But that wasn't a political decision. That was just a decision by the Bank of England themselves. So those decisions that had previously been made by chancellors had been outsourced. And we've seen the same now on fiscal policy with Jeremy Hunt, the former chancellor, saying things like, well, I can't, give duty-free access for tourists to London because the OBR telling me no.
Well, and this is really important because the OBR's scoring, that is to say, the OBR's judgment of what a particular policy does, influences policies that you would have thought had nothing to do with the fiscal side. So mass migration is a policy that the OBR strongly supports, and there were discussions in government about this because people were saying, if we have an extra 100,000 people, that is X% on
Absolutely.
GDP, that reduces the deficit. And so the OBR was a major and malign influence behind the mass migration that we've had in the last 3 years.
That is completely accurate. And they share a worldview with the Treasury. So the Treasury has always had a view. It wanted to be close to Europe. It believes in high regulation. It prefers big business to small business. This is why it's been so tough on IR35. It just doesn't really like small businesses or sole traders. It supports projects generally near London where they think there are bigger returns. So the worldview of the Treasury is baked into everything the Treasury does, the OBR does, and the Bank of England does. So what you find is a Keynesian way of thinking has been adopted through government, and now it's very, very difficult for politicians to challenge that. And what Rachel Reeves is essentially saying is she wants it even harder for government ministers to challenge. And you asked me earlier, Jacob, why it was that ministers have outsourced these responsibilities. I think they wanted to avoid tough decisions.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and we see that in the National Health Service, where there's been a desire to hand things over to NHS England so that you have some third party who decides whether to build a hospital or close a hospital rather than the Secretary of State. But it makes no difference because you saw...
The public still blame you.
That's what I was going to say to you. Politicians don't gain from doing this. The bureaucrats, however, are secure.
Yes, and they've become more and more powerful. And also politicians have used the whole independence of bureaucrats to attack other politicians. So further delegitimising politicians and saying we can only trust the independent experts. We saw that a lot during COVID. We can only trust the scientists. We can only trust, the people with medical expertise. We can only trust the economists. And we know that economists' forecasts are almost always wrong. But it's partly a dereliction of duty by politicians, but it's also playing into the anti-politics mood. But the irony is, of course, the more power that politicians hand out, the even more they're despised.
But we were in office for 14 years. Not just your period of office, but people we like and admire, like Boris Johnson, were in charge. We had a majority of 80 at the end. In the coalition era, we had a majority of 70. Why didn't we do anything about it? What is our failure? Because before we can work out what to do next, don't we need to look at ourselves and see what we got wrong?
Well, I think our problems go right back to the 1990s. They go back to the then Conservative opposition, essentially accepting Blairism, accepting the Human Rights Act, which has now made it very, very hard to deport illegal immigrants, accepting the Equality Act, which essentially embedded wokery into our schools and institutions, accepting the Climate Change Act, which gave the power to decide carbon targets to another independent body, accepting the Bank of England Act wholesale, which made it impossible to move a governor on, or in fact for the government to really have a say over monetary policy. But, we weren't around at that time. We maybe could have done more in 2010 to challenge the senior ministers at the time and say these are the things we really needed to change. But I think certainly personally, by the time I got to sufficient seniority to just see how bad it had got, how difficult it was to do things as a minister, it was too late. We'd run out of time.
And so if we look to the future, how is this going to be changed? Because it looks to me as if it's going to become more extreme. I'm also interested that if you look at the King's speech, the King's speech could, 75% of it, possibly more, have been the King's speech of the previous Conservative government.
That tells you what you need to know, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. And the budget earlier in the year could have been delivered by Rachel Reeves other than the 2p off national insurance. That you've got a political and bureaucratic system, of which we have been part, that seems to decide...
We have been ejected from it, Jacob.
Well, we may have been by the voters.
We're now by the voters.
By the voters who held us accountable for this failure, but they have voted us out, but nothing has changed. How do we get change in future?
So people did vote for change. They voted for change in 2016. They voted for change in 2019. They were desperate for change by 2024, and we hadn't delivered change. And I've talked about what I think were the bureaucratic obstacles. There were other obstacles as well, such as Conservative MPs not being conservative enough and not being prepared to stand on their principles and giving in to lobby groups, whether those were environmental lobby groups or woke lobby groups, because they wanted to be popular at, London dinner parties. There were all those factors as well. What do we need to do now? Well, we need to be the party of change. And we need to actually not just attack Labour for what they do over the next 5 years, and God knows it's terrible. Ed Miliband is going to push the prices of energy up to astronomical levels. We're going to see appalling levels of taxation. Our public services are not going to be fixed. They're going to be made worse. We know that no roads are going to be built now. So the traffic jams we're all experiencing are going to get worse. But we can't just attack Labour. We actually have to say, this is the problem with the unaccountable bureaucracy. Here is what Andrew Bailey is doing wrong. Here's the lack of accountability of the Office of Budget Responsibility. This is the problem with the Climate Change Committee. We have to point out the structural failures in Britain so that we have, in the future, a mandate to actually change it. And I think that is our challenge. That is our absolute challenge.
And this is what we've learned from our period in office. It's essentially learning from our mistakes and putting them into place. But we have to admit that we made mistakes in 2010 to 2024.
We absolutely did. And I think we can look across the Atlantic for an example of the way that Donald Trump talks about draining the swamp. It is the same issue that they have in the United States about the difficulty of getting Conservative policies through. And I think one thing I did want to say is what we know is the bureaucracy is fundamentally hostile to Conservative policies. Now, there was an incident in the King's speech where the memo personally criticised me and my government that was written by impartial civil servants. Now, that shows to me that there is a groupthink, there is a leftist groupthink within the bureaucracy itself. And I think we need to be very clear about that. There are too many Conservatives who think they can simply turn up, on the first day of a job as a minister, hand over the list of proposals and it will get done. I'm afraid that is not true. We now have a bureaucracy that is hostile on the whole. There are some good civil servants, don't get me wrong, but is hostile to Conservative policies. And we've seen the Director of Propriety and Ethics, Sue Gray, is now the Labour Chief of Staff.
Indeed. Well, the London sewer was put in after the big stink, so I think draining the swamp is an appropriate analogy. Thank you very much, Liz.